Hey, how's it going, everybody? Here today is another episode of MC and Mad Talking Civil War. This is episode 9. The what's the name of this campaign? The Henry-Donelson campaign. This was in the West as well. It's another campaign ran by Grant, and this time he actually wins. Huh. How are you doing today, MC?
All right. How are you doing?
Well, I'm good, and yes, I do know there's some major news out today. Something happened in Florida. I'm sure everybody's heard about it. We will be talking about that on the Red Eye tomorrow. Get prepared for more gun control debates. God damn it! But with that out of the way, um, I don't remember really learning about this campaign much, especially in high school. Even in my reading I've done on my own since then, this campaign doesn't really come up very often. Anything you remember about it right offhand before we
Oh
actually
yeah,
look at
this
the
this is
timeline?
a major this is a major setback for the Confederacy. All right. People who if you don't realize what this did, this is basically the start of the ability to use what the North has, all right, that the South never will have, and that's resources. The ability of the North to actually move on these rivers is a direct result of their ability to be able to build ships and have that kind of material, all right, and do it at will. The reason you don't see the South doing this is they just don't have the steel and the iron in order to compete. And so they are forced to try and defend these riverways, which are basically the travel ways in America at this point. Yes, railroads have begun, but railroads are just in their infancy for the most part. Additionally, all right, it still has the same problem that the South also has. There's no steel, right? You don't have the materials to be able to compete, and this is basically showing you the real weakness in the Confederacy when it came to warfare and their ability to deal with logistics.
Well, no, exactly. And the waterways really are more of a hindrance to the Confederacy than anything else because it allows the Union to rapidly capture large areas of territory, especially via the Mississippi. Look at New Orleans for one.
Well, it's not just that it allows them to capture large areas of territory. No, and that is very true. You're correct. But it also allows them to maneuver. It allows them, for example, all right, at the start of this campaign, you can see it, all right, in the maps, you'll see it. The Confederates by numbers actually outnumber in many ways the Union forces. The problem is if the Confederates attempt to use those superior forces, they have to come out of defense works and then they have to march. The Union at that point has the ability, because of the gunboats, to flank. This is why they're forced into the strategy of trying to defend these forts, because they can't afford not to. If they attempt that kind of a movement, what would happen is they would just get flanked because of the superior movement ability of the North, or the Union in this case, right? And Grant is fully understands this and is taking full advantage of this, and he does throughout the war.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, sorry about the dead air there. I'm actually switching over to the timeline here so we can start digging into it. So it opens up here. I'll go ahead and screen share, I suppose.
Okay,
Yeah.
and you can see what the strategy basically is, right? He's going to sit up there and take Fort Henry. He's going to take Fort Donaldson. There's another smaller fort that he takes earlier on, right? He arrives with his forces from Cairo, Illinois, upriver, all right? That ability in and of itself is tremendous, right? He then moves two brigades, all right, to operate along both banks of the Tennessee River. Fort Heineman, all right, which is on the west bank, has to be abandoned by the Confederates. All right, the reason it had to be abandoned is that it was in a no-win situation, would have easily been surrounded. They decided to try and consolidate their troops at Fort Henry. right? That's why they're abandoning this. This is not necessarily an unsound strategy, but the fact that you're able to land troops on both sides of the river and then basically proceed along the entire front. And what does this give you? Okay, if you start to create a strong point as a Confederacy on one side of the river or the other side, which is what they're able to successfully do in another campaign we'll be talking about, the Peninsula campaign. All right. But in this case, with the riverboats being in total control of the Union, he's able to shift, meaning Grant is able to shift his forces back and forth very rapidly. All right, so there is no advantage. The South has no ability to do this. And even worse is they could easily lay a trap where the South pulls out, runs all their heavier forces out on one area, and they're just basically bypassed by the Union forces, right? Because of their control of the waterway and the speed at which it gives them, the speed of movement.
Well, yeah, no, and okay, so yeah, under command of the Union is General Ulysses S. Grant, as MC had just said. He has 15,000 men. The Confederates are commanded by General Lord Timon, Army of Central Kentucky, and he only has 3,200, but he has 2 forts. And as I was saying earlier up here, Grant, he had tried at first to take the forts and with the Navy through the river, and the Confederates, with accurate artillery fire, were able to clear the boats away and make them fall back. It was only when Grant had additional reinforcements come in that he is actually able to sack these 2 forts.
Well, there's a difference between sacking and taking. He doesn't sack the forts.
Well, he doesn't burn them down. You're right. He uses them, but yeah, he does take them. Sorry.
But no, and it basically is able to do a ground offensive as well as a water offensive, right? And that's a Fort Henry, and then going down further, he goes to attack Fort Donelson.
Yeah, and he takes.
There's a hell of a lot more troops at Fort Donelson than just 3,500 troops.
Yeah, I'm wondering, because you were saying the Confederates had more forces than that, so I'm wondering where they got these numbers from, actually.
Well, because there's several different reasons. I'm not exactly sure where those numbers are coming from either, but when you see him take the prisoners at Fort Donelson, he takes 13,000 prisoners.
Oh wow, okay. But yeah, let's go ahead and start this timeline now. February 4th, 1862. En route to Fort Hyman and Fort Henry down the Tennessee River, General Grant arrives at Camp Halleck with his forces. General McClernand's, how do you say that fucking name? That's not McClellan.
McClernand.
Yeah, what the fuck? Okay, you heard him see it. He said his name correctly. His division is disembarked along the eastern shore, out of range of Fort Henry's guns. So immediately, General Grant splits his forces to both sides of the river. Usually I would think that would be a risky endeavor, but they do control the river with the boat with their own ships. So I guess it's not as risky as I would think.
Right. Well, because having the ability, you got to remember these are not just gunboats; these are also troop ships. So you can move troops back and forth across the river very rapidly. You don't have to try and ford the river. They're not stuck on one side of the river or the other. He's got movement back and forth. He's got lateral movement as well as vertical movement.
Yeah, no, and it follows up with February 5th, talking about General Grant has General Charles Smith's division disembarked along the western shore of the Tennessee. Just like I said, he splits his forces to both sides of the river. At 11 a.m. on the 6th, that the general that has the weird last name is ordered by General Grant to begin his march towards Fort Henry at 11 a.m. It's not showing any Confederate movement. Do you know what the Confederates are doing at this time, or they just hold up inside the forts?
Well, at this point in time, you got to remember they're not anywhere near this. All right. the major troops, the major forces are not near these forces at this point. They're going to get there under Fort Donelson. They're not there yet. And as a result, no, the Confederate forces are not moving. They're basically in place. They're basically forced in place with the exception of what's in Fort Heileman, where they basically abandoned Fort Heileman and attempted to reinforce Fort Henry.
Well, no, and I'm not really enjoying this timeline. It's not going in depth at all here. Okay, so February 6th, Union flag officer Foote leads his gunboat flotilla against Fort Henry. The action takes place at 11 a.m. until about 1:55 p.m. and is in concert with the land movements of General McClellan and General Smith under Grant. But that's all they say. I mean, at that point, the Confederates are opening up their guns and firing upon the gunboats, I would assume, and also trying to defend their position from the land elements. But it's not going in any detail here.
Well,
because then it just
a little further down. A little further down, it goes at 6 p.m. on the date that Grant's troops finally claimed to occupation Fort McHenry, or Fort Henry rather, on the Tennessee River. Basically, at this point, they've not only surrounded the fort, they've actually gone over the top. They've actually taken the fort, and they've reduced it with action both on the ground and through the river. You got to remember, I mean, this is a total campaign. They're completely surrounded. The fort can't hold. It doesn't have the troops under it. I mean, obviously, they're way outnumbered. And when you outnumber your enemy by over 4 to 1, which is the first part of this battle, Grant's troops obviously more than outnumber what's left in Fort Henry, right? And they overrun it.
Well, why didn't the Confederates consolidate their troops at one fort then? They had already abandoned a earlier fort and just let it go into enemy hands. Why not fall back when they saw the movements and knew that they couldn't defend? Fall back to Fort Donelson along the Cumberland and at least be able to put up a fight there. Well, because they ended up losing both.
They probably could have done a fighting withdrawal and so forth in an attempt to try and slow down the movement. How effective that would have been quite difficult. But you've also got to remember the Southern Command isn't as unified at this point under a single general, right? Things are still as chaotic as it's been for the Union, and it's been very, very chaotic. There are elements of chaos that are affecting the Confederacy as well. Their generals are political generals in some cases. Their areas that they're defending, where they get their troops from, how well those troops are trained, etc., right, and how effective they are still up for debate. Okay, meaning that they don't know who the better generals are. They don't know who has the better troops, and they're attacking along the Tennessee. The problem with the Tennessee is the same problem they had with Kentucky. While probably the majority of the populace were quote unquote Confederate sympathizers, it wasn't an overwhelming majority. It wasn't like South Carolina or Georgia. Or, the vast majority of the people probably wanted to be left alone, and then there was a huge Northern sympathies in both of these areas. There were Union sympathies in both of these areas. So later on, go ahead. No, go ahead. You're going to say something, and I'm just getting ready to slap it down. Don't worry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, though, reading a little bit forward in the timeline, at that point, Foote keeps 4 gunboats for local action and sends 4 up the river for raiding actions. So if there is a lot of Union sympathies in the area, I'm pretty sure that fades away as the gunboats start raiding the area. But
when you say raid, I mean that's not necessarily. You got to look at what a raid actually does. A raid is just trying to be a spoiling attack in an attempt to prevent any kind of enemy movement generally, or to force a retreat along logistical lines. It's not necessarily that they're going in there just taking farmland and seizing farm foodstuffs.
Well, fair enough, but if you send a gunboat on a raid, I'm pretty sure they're firing from the deck of said gunboat, um, at soft targets, which soft targets are usually not necessarily military targets.
No, no, they're not. You're not firing at soft targets. You're basically, like I said, what are you going to do with a gunboat? What are you going to fire on? You're going to try and fire on enemy points. You're not going to. You're not just going to go right there
Manufacturing
and.
areas, any area where they would have a stockpile
You
of
don't
food or
see that.
ammunition.
There's not really a whole lot of manufacturing in these areas. All right, so if there's like a wharf or something like that, which shows a lot of foodstuffs or something like that, then possibly. But at this point in the war, you're not seeing the total war concept coming to fruition as it does later on.
Well, no, and looking at the chat, Voice of One says the South lost. Get over it. Actually, they do lose this campaign, and they lose it pretty badly, and it does affect the Western theater quite a bit throughout the continuation of the war.
Right, but the reality is if you can say that it's a Southern loss, and it obviously is, but it's not because the South wasn't trying to fight. It was the South can't. They don't have the ability here. All right, this is a major weakness that the South is never able to overcome. They're not able to deal with the fact that, from a logistical standpoint, they are heavily outnumbered. All right, by the Union forces, and they're not going to get any better.
Now, so the Union is able to use these rivers to travel back and forth and do punitive raids, capture territory. Isn't there something they could have did, like fucking booby trap the river or something? I mean, there's got to be some way to slow them down without just a fort.
They'll put booms. They'll do logs in the rivers and so forth. But the problem is that in order to do that and make it effective, you have to be able to control at least one side, if not both sides of the river. And the South is not able to ever do that. The North is able to land troops on either side of the river and act as a clearing force so that the rivers can constantly be swept and moved.
Yeah, but I mean, they could have prepared ahead of time. They knew that the Union would be using the rivers as their roadway in the West.
Okay, but how long is that really going? You got to remember, rivers are not like the ocean, right? You can't just put a mine there and expect it to stay, because the rivers flow and they move that kind of stuff around all over the place. Later on, in certain areas where they control the strong points on those rivers, they're able to do it successfully until those points are taken. But that's the point of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Okay, is so that they can sit up there and prevent the Union forces from running the river and running up and down the river. But when the Union lands troops on both sides of the river, it's over. The game is up. You're not going to be able to hold it.
Did President Davis understand the value of the Western area of this war? Because he seems to be focused entirely on the East and could give a rat's ass about the Western theater.
I don't think that that's the case. To be honest, I think it has more to do with where the successes were. Okay, and also where Washington is. That remains one of the reasons why there's such a focus on the East, right? Because that's and then there's the other aspect of it is the East is also, for all intents and purposes, that is the population center, right, of the Confederacy and of the Union. There you got a lot more people in those two areas, right, on both sides. So I think it's just a natural consequence of things. I don't think it was because he was necessarily ignoring the Western theater. I just think that that's just a consequence of how it was going to develop.
Well, I'll show my work here. My line of thought on him ignoring the Western theater is these forts seem drastically undermanned. I mean, really, if you're going to have a fort to control a waterway that once it falls into enemy hands, you fucking screwed the pooch, then you need more troops there to hold the fort.
Where are the troops? Where are the troops at? Where do you need to get troops at?
Well, can't you funnel them from first off, Tennessee Home Guard should have been able to put a lot of troops in
once again. Tennessee was not as pro-South as you think it was. They couldn't get the number of troops simply because there weren't. the Tennessee, first of all, wasn't as populous as some of the other states, but even if it was, the number of people willing to fight for the Confederacy wasn't the man pool. The pool of manpower that they had was significantly less than what you see in Virginia and what you see in like Georgia and so forth. Right? You don't have the staffing. You really just don't have the numbers to that degree.
What about Texas? Texas
Texas
I mean, they could have funneled troops up.
Okay, to what extent? Not very many. All right, and you got to remember how large Texas is. Texas is huge. Yeah, they have a lot. They have a decent population? Yeah, to an extent, but just how far down are you going to sit up there and take it per capita? Okay, there just isn't the number of troops in the West as there's going to be in the East. The manpower pool is just completely different. Now, theoretically, could you move those troops? Sure, to an extent you can. Obviously, there are Texans that join the Army of Northern Virginia. Right? There are contingents from all over the South. There's people from Mississippi, etc. Right? But they never outnumber the local troops in those areas. That's never the case.
Well, no, and those are all good points. But when you're looking at the Western theater, all these early battles, I think the Confederates could have had more of a chance if they were able to funnel resources and manpower to the key forts, and actually hold the Union off there.
What would have happened? All right, if if you want to play this hypothetical game, we're going to get into something that happens a little bit later on that I'm sure we're going to talk about. All right, what are you going to do? You're going to send Jackson down there? If you send Jackson down there, do you give up the entire Shenandoah? Right? Who are you going to send? You're going to send Longstreet down there? Right? Are you going to sit up there and invite the attack?
Hill? What about Hill?
You send Hill down there. You send AP Hill down there, then he isn't available for the repulse of on the Peninsula campaign. You know, these are all factors as a part of this.
Well, no, and that's a very valid point. It's just they had to have somebody. They had to have something they could have sent down there to hold.
Why did they have to have somebody? Because you wished for it to be so?
No, because
we're back to the wish in one hand and shit in the other? Is that what we're dealing with now?
No. God damn it. No, because if you look at the Western theater, they had manpower over there. They had a lot of people, like we were talking about last week, in these roaming bands of fucking cutthroats and shit in Missouri.
Those roving bands of cutthroats were never that many. This is
but we're talking about 3,200 people holding a fort or two forts. 3,200. You're telling me that even if it wasn't that many, if they could have boistered their numbers up to 5,000, they would have stood a better chance.
They may have stood a better chance, but where are we going to get those people from? Where are we going to draw them from?
Yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know.
I mean, okay, so you bolster Fort Henry up, all right. It's still going to get surrounded. You're still not going to be able to hold it, and you're going to end up losing the campaign for Donelson's either sooner or later, right? It wouldn't have changed the material effect on the difference on the correlation of the forces. It just couldn't. The other problem is that there aren't established roads here, right? I mean, most of this is backwoods areas, so you don't have ease of movement for the South. How are they going to reinforce these areas when it's hard to even travel in those areas?
Once again, all valid points. And when the Union controls the riverway, then you can't use that. So, not to mention the South has no navy.
But it's not just that. It's the control. Yeah, that's a part of it. But it's also the fact that not only can the Union control those areas, they can because they can build ships at will. The South can't. They don't have the manufacturing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the big reasons they lost the war, and they probably were destined to lose the war after Lincoln got reelected. If McClellan would have won, he would have ended the war. That's why Lee ends up going into the Antietam campaign. But anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. We can go back to that timeline you want if you want. Let's see. Okay, so General Grant orders an advance force to begin their march towards Fort Donelson on February 11th. On the 12th. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, if you got something you want to say about that, go for it.
No. Just go on, because I'm going to say something pretty soon here.
Okay. February 12th, 1862. Despite the combined strength of General fucking douchebag and Smith, General Grant is forced to stop within 12 miles of Fort Donelson as he remains outnumbered. So you're right. Now at Donelson, they have far more troops than they did at what fort was it?
Fort Henry.
Yeah, Fort Henry. So they have to stop 12 miles away. Now, okay, the Union Army is 12 miles away. You know you're there. You're in command of the fort. Do you send out an expedition, a force to try and crush them in the open field because you outnumber them and that's why they stopped? Or do you sit tight and wait for them to come?
Okay, if you outnumber them and you go into attack, you're assuming that they're just standing there waiting there in an open field for you.
Well, I know damn well they're not, and they would see you coming as well because they have scouts and fucking.
They also have a flank that can't be turned, called the river, and you can't touch that flank because if you get close to it, you get shelled.
Yeah, but you could try and go out there and see if he'll follow you, right? You go and you attack the flank that's away from
where's he going to go? If you come out, where's he going to go? If you leave that,
you think he'd go, you know what, screw this army here shooting at me. Let's go take the fort.
Well, why wouldn't he sit there and put a screening force there and load those troops on the ship and just go right to the fort and take it?
Well, you would still have troops at the fort shelling the ships as they came. That's still an issue.
Not very much. not if they can put troops on the ground right there. And what's worse is that if they're able to go that far over, all right, far enough to where, let's say he's able to land troops not at the fort necessarily, but in between the fort and those troops there. Now he's got them in a pincher movement, and it's basically a three-pronged box. The Confederate forces could have found themselves being shot at by three sides. What are they going to do?
Well, yeah, no, and I brought up the map here so everybody can get a better idea. Here's the Tennessee River over here. And then you have the Cumberland and Fort Donelson on the other side. So if they stopped 12 miles away, so they're, February 15th. Or no, so it was February 11th. I don't know. I think the Confederates could have maneuvered and try to get them in between the two rivers because they don't really have their flank on the river like you were saying. They're 12 miles away from it.
They can move. Remember, they can move these troops there. This is where the advantage is. You have to go up further where you can see where the Tennessee, where they can disembark troops across over to the Cumberland. Okay. Remember, these are gunboats that they have on the Cumberland as well. You can see them actually in the area for the February 16th. It's easy enough for them to come down there and then put a trap there, boxing in the defenders, all right, in a box. And now you're going to hit them from both sides, if not three sides.
Yeah, but if you're out in the open, you can maneuver your troops. You have a chance. If you're sitting in a fort...
All right, have you been through this area of Tennessee?
No, sir.
All right, this area is freaking heavily wooded. Movement is not something you could just like in the Peninsula Campaign, movement through these woods and everything isn't such an easy thing. And to stop 12 miles away and dig in, even though you outnumber them, you have to significantly outnumber a heavily defended area. And let's be honest, Grant has his people fully supplied here. You're not walking into a non-supplied area where you can then surround it. You don't have enough troops to surround it, right? So you could engage in battle to what end? Just to lose more troops and run back to Fort Donelson? Why not just stay in Fort Donelson to start with?
Because you're just a sitting duck. You're waiting to get surrounded and captured at that point, right?
So then what your other choice is just to abandon Fort Donelson, right?
That might have been better than what they did because they stay and fight and then they get captured. So yes, if
that is true. You can look at it that way, but once
you
again,
burn the
you at
fort,
least
you take the guns, you burn the fort, and you fall back.
right, and then you get accused of doing what Bragg was doing, all right, all the way through to Chattanooga.
I know, and I hate Bragg. I know, but you argued with me about forts 2 weeks ago, and that really stuck in my head a little bit. And I'm just thinking they're just sitting there waiting to get captured, and that's eventually what happens. So if you burn the fort, you take the guns, and you fall back. That's a better outcome than what ends up happening here.
I would agree with you, and especially from a hindsight perspective, you can see that. But the reality is that they're trying to prevent any kind of movement to the best of their ability, and they fail. That's just the way reality is. Sometimes reality sucks.
Well, no, and it's Johnson, Buckner, in command here. It says on the map. I don't know much about Buckner or this Johnson either, actually, because most of the reading I've done has been in the East. The Army of Northern Virginia. But
Johnson is the same Johnson at Shiloh.
Okay, all right. Then he wasn't inept. He should have known better.
Or is it Johnson? Hold on a second. Well, who are the Confederates?
Buckner and Johnson. Johnson, not Johnston.
Okay, no, that's not Johnston. It's Johnson. Okay, no, I don't. Obviously, the names are forgettable because they failed.
Well, Buckner, that name rings a bell. I can't place it, but I've heard of that guy's
There's
name.
a number of Buckners actually on both sides of the war. You'll see that name again on the Union side. So, but it's not the same. It's not the same person.
Oh, well, obviously, that'd be a little odd. It'd be interesting explaining that one to everybody.
Yeah,
let's see.
That happens. That's something else that happens a lot of times in these battles. People tend to forget because we remember certain individuals. They forget that there were a number of Jacksons on both sides of the war, right? There were a number of people whose names you will read that were on both sides. For like Hill, there's a number of hills. There's AP Hill is just one of the hills that was fighting for the South. Okay, and you'll see that as a general for the South. But so it's kind of hard sometimes to know. Okay, which one was this guy? Which one was that guy? I mean, that's one of the reasons why people came up with nicknames. It's easier to know when you say Stonewall Jackson. You know what specific individual you're always going to be referring to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this map might be a little bit better. It shows more of the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers. Yeah, I'm still caught up on the fact that they let themselves get surrounded. I mean,
look at February 12th. Look at where the Union forces are able to move from February 7th to the 13th and the 12th. This is why you don't abandon the fort and try and take them on early.
Yeah, you would have been encircled then as well, obviously. Well, I don't know.
Once again, once they get encircled, they could have been encircled. Where's your supplies coming from? How are you going to feed your men?
Well, you feed them with the Yankee supplies after you kill them all.
Good luck.
Hey, it worked in day one of Shiloh. They got a nice breakfast out of the deal.
Yeah, and they were eating breakfast the next day when they freaking got whacked too, weren't they?
But anything else you want to bring up about this? Because I don't know that much about this campaign, and I don't see any way the Confederates could have gotten out of this. Because you're right, they would have been accused of being just like Bragg. Like, what the fuck did you just do? You burnt Fort Donelson to the ground and fucking ran? I mean, this is early in the war. So they still
in a no-win situation, right? They're not able to maneuver. The maneuver is on the side of the enemy. They don't have the forces in the places where they can where they can put them in, and quite frankly, their forces are not as extensive, right? As everyone seems to think that they are, right? You don't have the kind of numbers to deal with what the Union is bringing. As you can tell throughout, one of the things that should be noted throughout this entire little campaign here is day after day, the Union forces are increasing in numbers by dramatically. You see a dramatic increase day after day of Union forces. The Union is starting to mobilize. All right. The South had done a mobilization, but now are pretty close to their peak. And once again, you're dealing with Kentucky and you're dealing with Tennessee, and Union sympathies were much higher in these areas, all right, than they were in other areas of the South. Part of the reason for that is, to be quite frank, is you don't have the number of slaves and plantations in these areas. You have just small farms from people, right? You don't have the huge plantations in Tennessee that you see in Georgia, that you see in Virginia, and the tobacco areas of the Carolinas, right? And so there, you also have abolitionist movements that are also a part of this, that weren't necessarily a part of some of these other areas.
No, and that's a very valid point. But looking at the timeline, this is actually interesting. February 13th, 1862, without orders from General Grant, both Douchebag and Smith launch unsuccessful attacks against Fort Donelson. They are repelled.
Yes.
Yes, and then on the 14th, it follows up.
What does that do? What does that do?
Well, no, and real quick, because I want you to comment on both of these. So on the 13th, they repelled the ground forces. On the 14th, under heavy and accurate fire, Union flag officer Foote, his gunboat flotilla are repelled by the guns of Fort Donelson as well. So these 2 days, it's looking okay for the fort. It's looking like they're going to be able to hold it at this moment anyway.
Yes, it looks that way, but what is it also preventing?
I don't know. Go ahead.
Preventing the South from leaving. Preventing the troops from escaping.
That's true. And
at this point now, they can't run away. So you're holding them in place. Now, when the attack happened on the 12th, or the 13th rather, those generals were not attacking because they wanted to do some kind of holding actions to prevent or fix it, what we call fixing action rather, to try and fix the Southern forces so they couldn't get away. Well, they were basically doing it for their own vainglorious reasons. All right. And although it wasn't explicitly against Grant's orders either, Grant didn't order them not to charge. So, we were there, we thought we had a chance, so we sit up there and took it and we attacked. Okay. The attack was repulsed, which means that was a pretty bloody affair at that point. Right. So then the gunboats come up and they fire. Well, can I take it by the sea? Foote's trying to make a name for himself as well. Well, no, they're able to get repulsed from that point as well. Okay, so now then this leads up to the next assault, which is the combined assault between the land and the I said sea, but water. All right, in this case the river, right, which does succeed.
Well, yeah, and also on the 14th, as the gunboats are being repelled, Union forces under Lew Wallace arrive at Fort Donelson from Fort Hyman and are further reinforced by fresh troops transport via the river, the Cumberland River. With 3 divisions now formed under Grant, he holds numerical superiority against the defenders of Fort Donelson. That being said, though, having a fort and having the big guns of the fort does kind of level the playing ground a little
bit. Not really, because the guns, your guns can only point in one direction at a time. You can't be defending against a land attack while you're getting attacked from the river, and you can't defend against the river if you get an attack from the land. There's only so many big guns that you can stick in these forts.
Fair enough.
And what's more is as you start a cannon fire back and forth, you knock out a Union gun, another Union gun comes up. You knock out a Confederate gun, what's replacing it?
Well, exactly. With the fort being attacked, and I think surrounded pretty much, there's no way to get reinforcements up from anywhere.
Correct.
If you're going to reinforce the fort, you had to do it 3 or 4 days before. Like,
well, you had to make sure you had to prevent it from being surrounded, because once it became surrounded, if you couldn't break the troops that are surrounding it, if you had no forces to do that with, you're done. It's at that point in time, it is just a matter of time, right? And with the amount of firepower that, especially from guns, all right, that the Union can bring up with guns and powder. This is the other thing, your cannons use up a tremendous amount of gunpowder, So how long can you keep firing versus how long can they keep firing, right? This sounds like, well, the South then should have more heavily resupplied it. Where do you put the gunpowder when in a fort? Okay, sooner or later, powder magazines tend to explode, right? So you don't necessarily want these things chock full of powder all the time, all right? In some of these cases, especially if you don't have a way of preventing it from premature detonation. All these things have to be a consideration.
No, absolutely. And there's only one thing left in the timeline, and then we'll just go from there back and forth. February 16th, Union General Grant is victorious at Fort Donelson along the Tennessee River in Tennessee. 14,000 prisoners are taken after the general demands an unconditional and immediate surrender. This is how Grant becomes unconditional surrender Grant, or whatever they were fucking calling him.
Yeah, that's what they all said. Well, that's what the S stands for in his name. And in reality, all right, because somebody listened to him wrong at West Point, they gave him the initial S. It was never his middle name. His middle initial, I think his middle name was Hiram, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I don't know. I never really liked
Grant. And his friends at West Point, including Longstreet, they're the ones that called him Sam as a joke because they got his name wrong.
Yeah, no, and that's really a good point too. Is Longstreet and Grant went to West Point together and were buddy, right? They were friends.
Yep. They were friends, and they served in Mexico together as well.
Did they ever? They did have to face each other in the Civil War, didn't they?
Well, yeah. During the entire Petersburg campaign, you could say they were facing each other the entire time.
That would be rough. It's your job to go kill your good buddy, right?
Well, at that point, it was. It might have been rougher on Grant than it was on Longstreet, because for all intents and purposes, they were hoping for a continued battle of maneuver where they could never get pinned down, and of course that comes to an end at Petersburg.
Yeah, no, and the next episode will be the Battle of Hampton Roads. I think, yep, that's Virginia. That we're headed back to the east next week. So that's good.
You go back to Hampton Roads and then the Shenandoah campaign.
Yep, and I actually know a lot more about that. So
if you move those troops out of that area to reinforce the people in the West, what are you going to do? You got to remember, the North outnumbers material and manpower wise the South completely outnumbers.
Well, no, and that's why a part of me wants to think that Davis was a little weak in running the war. He probably should have known, if they try to do a war of attrition and just hold the North off and get some kind of settlement to, create the Confederate States of America, that they would lose. They had to take the fight to the enemy. And the only times they really did that was under Robert E. Lee, and he got turned around both times. But earlier in the war, if they would have struck north, they could have got some material goods. They could have put some fear into the people. They could have, I don't know.
What would have happened is it would have strengthened the resolve of the North to go in there and finish this off. I really don't think that they had the capability of attempting that kind of an action, especially the way you're talking about it. Well, that would have just turned into, okay, the South struck North. All you're complaining about, well, what are you fighting this war for? Well, because you're down here, it goes out the freaking window if you've done a lot of early on punitive raids to attack in the North.
Yeah, but when it comes to war is not pretty. You always say that repeatedly
It's
to
not
me.
pretty, and
So
from that standpoint, you are correct. But once again, we're talking about the situation as it existed during the time frame it existed in, not the time frame that we wanted it existed.
well, yeah, no, and at that time frame, okay, so Grant really pissed off the commander of Fort Donelson with the unconditional and immediate surrender terms, because he had at first just said, "Hey, well, you know, can we we'll surrender the fort? Can we withdraw or whatever?" And Grant's like, "Fuck no, fuck you."
Well, okay.
Well, no. Once again, though,
So Grant should have stood up
time frame,
and said that.
but in that time frame, wasn't it customary to not really do an unconditional surrender? If they surrender the fort, usually you make them lay their arms down and they can leave.
That's not what they did in Fort Sumter.
True. True.
I mean, the reason that there was a little bit of a controversy in that is the person who initially relayed the surrender to Fort Donelson kind of gives an indication that maybe it won't be unconditional. All right. So that's what that was. That comes from the person that Grant chose to act as the initial intermediary, right? And unfortunately, you know, it comes back from Grant unconditional surrender, and of course the Confederate commander said, "Well, that's not what we were being told. You know, that's not what we were agreeing to." But for all intents and purposes, at that point, surrender was inevitable. So it was like, okay, well, you're going to have to accept it, even if you don't like it.
Yeah, either that or they could have been like, up yours and just set the place on fire and go out shooting. Fuck you, Grant. You could have the ashes of the fort.
Yeah, they could have done that, and would they have gone down as martyrs like Masada? I tend not to believe so.
Yeah, I don't know how it would have been looked upon. Okay, so they take 3 forts pretty quickly. I think this campaign was 10 days.
Yep.
Now Tennessee's not looking very fucking good. Politically, what does this do to both the Union and the Confederacy?
Well, the first thing is now is because the disasters in the North, right, in the earlier part of the war, people were in the Union quite dispirited. The fact that they have these victories now bolsters their morale. Worse, all right, is it negatively affects the morale in the South in that, holy crap, we can be beaten, we're vulnerable. All right, that the Yankees will fight, that the Yankees can win. It's not all going our way. All right, they were telling themselves up to this point, okay, everything's going our way. It's just a matter of time. We'll defeat the Yankees. They're not, their troops are substandard. They're not, tough enough. However you want to look at it, Well, now you're getting to a point of, the Union is able to win battles. The Union does have generals. The Union can fight. All right. And this puts additional pressure actually on several of the Confederate commanders, right? And causes them really to make a major mistake, in my opinion, in that they attack at Shiloh. And Shiloh, while you can look at it from a tactical standpoint, saying the first day was a victory, overall, tactically, it wasn't a good idea to attack there. You really wanted to pull Grant into a similar type of a battle, yes, but not where he can get resupplied from the river.
Yeah, the first day of Shiloh, it was looking really well. Once again, though, they ran out of daylight. They weren't organized. The troops dispersed and started fucking raiding the camp area, started taking the food and finding shoes and shit. Like, I don't know. If it was an organized, orderly assault, there might not have been a day 2 of Shiloh. They could have won
No,
that
you
on day
forget
one.
that Prentice basically held up at the hornet's nest for so long that there was no way that was ever going to happen. That whole battle turned on the fact that they couldn't. It took 15 charges, I think 15 assaults to take the hornet's nest.
Yeah, that was a bloody fucking affair. That was.
Okay, and in the last assault, you lose Albert Johnston. But we'll get into that. I mean, we'll go into that battle, but on a slightly different going. But that's really, people have to keep that in mind.
Well, after they lose these forts in Tennessee, isn't Tennessee, for all intents and purposes, out of the war at this point?
No, you still got Chattanooga, you got the eastern Tennessee, but for the western half of the Tennessee is now gone. All right, and this includes the ability to go up and down because remember, Tennessee borders the frickin' Mississippi. I mean,
yeah.
You now can go down all the way down to basically Memphis. All right, on the Mississippi is what this basically does. This is the start of the splitting campaign, where to split the Confederacy into two.
Yeah, which is why during the beginning of our conversation today, I was pushing the fact that the South should have found a way to keep this fort, one, well supplied, and two, well manned. And I really feel they didn't understand the concept there. And you could have used. What about Bragg? Bragg's in the West.
No, well, Bragg, not really. See, you're misunderstanding something. Where's Bragg at this point? He's on the eastern half, all right, because the Union can strike at will. Remember, they control the water, okay? There's no doubt about this. They can control the water. They can land troops in the Carolinas. They can land troops in Florida. They can land troops along that entire, eastern seaboard.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, the Union has the advantage of choosing where a lot of these battles are going to take place because they can sit up there and place troops along this entire eastern seaboard, all right, just by moving in boats. And furthermore, the South not only can't the South stop them from doing that, they themselves can't utilize that same technique because they don't have the infrastructure to actually be able to do it.
Yeah, which is why, I think it was like 3 weeks ago now, or maybe even a month. But when we were talking about the onset of the war, they gave up Norfolk. They gave up the shipyards. That was stupid. And they never go back and recapture it. I don't understand that.
They don't give up Norfolk basically, or the shipyards until the Peninsula Campaign.
Oh, okay. So that hasn't happened yet. Oh yeah, no, they're still repurposing the Merrimack, aren't they?
Correct.
So they're using the shipyard right now. Yeah.
They are building the CSS Virginia right now at this point in time of the war.
Which, yeah, we'll get into that. Oh man, they had to scuttle her. That was so fucking dumb.
Well, what else were you gonna do?
You go and attack the wooden ships with the Virginia, and you stay the fuck away from that other ironclad. Instead, they went toe to toe with it repeatedly. No,
well, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later. It wasn't like they had a choice.
Fair enough, yeah. And the ship was so fucking heavy, the thing barely stayed afloat. But yeah, we'll cover that later. Anything else you want to talk about on this one? If not, we're hitting the hour mark, and that's what we've been keeping these Civil War episodes at. So
I think we're done basically with this one right here. So.
All right, everybody. Yeah, next week we will be back in the East. Or unless you're busy. I don't know what your schedule is, MC.
No, next week is fine.
Okay, so yeah, we'll be back in the Eastern Theater next week. Tomorrow on the Red Eye. Back to the gun control debate, guys. God damn it. Everybody, good night. Good luck. And for God's sake, don't go to any Madden tournaments. We're out of here.